Hi, this is Gabor Sabo from the Perl Maven show again. With me is John Anderson, also known as genehack. Genehack, right?
Genehack. Yeah.
Hi.
I
I need your pronunciation for that. So tell me
Gene,
about it.
yeah,
Genehack, right?
Genehack.
Why?
I used to be a biologist. About a half and a half ago, I was a molecular biologist for a little bit, and I was a computational biologist for a little bit, and then I wasn't. But during the period when I was, I needed a handle, and so I was hacking genes. Genehack seemed like a good choice.
Right. When was this?
So this was when I was in graduate school. This was the late 90s. It was back when I first started using Perl, first started using Linux, kind of transitioned from biology background into what I do now, IT, computer stuff. So I was kind of stuck in my thesis work,
Mhm.
and had been there for about 5 years, spent about a year trying to finish up some experiments and just had failure after failure, just went into the lab every day and nothing worked. And then finally one day my advisor called me into his office and sat me down and said, I'm sick of you, sick
Oh,
of seeing you, I'm sick of your face. You're miserable and unhappy and you're making everybody else unhappy and you need to graduate and leave. So in order to do that, you have to make something work. So figure out something and make it work. So I went home and thought up a computational biology experiment and then had to teach myself how to program. And in order to do that, I had to move from using Macs to using Linux because that was Mac OS 8 days, and Perl on the Mac was not really you could make it work, but you couldn't learn Perl in that environment. It
oh.
was too weird how it integrated with the operating system. So had to try to learn Mac Perl, couldn't. Had to figure out how to install Linux on my Mac and make that work, and then learn Perl, and but I got it done eventually. So here
So
I
you
am.
learned Perl on Mac OS,
I
or
tried. I
or it
couldn't.
or it was it easier to learn Linux and then Perl than
Yes. The
okay.
trick, you really had to understand how Unix worked in order to use because in those days there was no underlying BSD system on the Macs.
Yeah.
It did its own total thing, and so there was if I recall correctly, there was kind of a shim layer that integrated the Perl stuff with the Mac OS, and you really had to know. I don't think you could learn Perl in that environment. It was too strange, too much new
I,
stuff at once.
did it have a command line? Where
It
Perl
did.
is
Actually, I don't know if there was anything like a REPL at all. It would open up stuff in a terminal window when you ran it. It would pop open a terminal window and
okay.
show you for standard out and standard error. But I don't think there was no way to do one-liners,
Oh,
for
interesting.
example. Yeah.
Okay, that's an interesting, strange world for me.
Yes.
But
It seems to me now, but at the time it was normal.
okay, so you're using Mac and Linux right now, right?
Mac Linux right now, yeah, it's mainly Macs on the desktop, just because it's easier. I ran Linux on the desktop for several years, and just at some point you go, sound broke again, and I had other things I was going to do this weekend other than try to figure out why my laptop stopped making noise.
Okay,
Um, so I need to,
something that works.
something that works. It's still Linux servers, for the real
Yeah,
work, but for the desktop.
yeah,
And it's not. I'm not a huge Mac person. Actually, most of the time I'm running like a web browser and a terminal, and then
yeah.
that's it.
So, by the way, I think I read on your website that you're using mostly Emacs, right?
Yes, yeah, I'm an Emacs person.
Did you have you already used Emacs before you started with Perl and Linux, or was that another thing that you learned
That
just
was
to get graduate?
that was another thing that I learned at the same time. Because of the Linux distribution I ended up running at that point. This was like 1998, 1999. Was a mock kernel based version of Linux for the PowerPC architecture. It ended up turning into Yellow Dog Linux eventually, but there weren't a lot of software packages for it, so I ended up compiling most things myself, and so Emacs was easier, I think, to build than anything else at that point for me, at least. Or it was the first thing that I tried to build that worked. Um,
Yeah.
so I've tried to switch to VI a couple of times, and it never seems to stick.
That's just two different worlds, I think. Yeah. So, as we know, so from there, you have stopped being a biologist or working in bioinformatics. What then?
Yeah, so I was still in biology for a little bit. I did a postdoc at the National Institutes of Health, and decided that I was kind of not really interested in doing science anymore, and ended up going out for beers regularly with the people in the system support group at the part of NIH where I worked. And it turned out they needed a Linux system administrator, and gosh, I knew all this Linux stuff now.
So
they were,
studies were useful.
exactly. I've sort of managed to fall forward happily all the way along. So they were primarily a Solaris shop at that point, but they needed a lot more systems. They needed to get onto the Intel architecture and off of the Spark architecture for cost reasons. So they were starting to look at Linux. So they hired me to be their first Linux admin. And I was there for, I think, 8 years, and ended up eventually with around 1,000 systems that we were, running. Moved from there to the Census Bureau. Did some programming at that point. I mean, the NIH job started out as systems administration, and then we kind of ended up doing something that was very much DevOps, although we didn't call it DevOps at that point. We just thought it was using programming to do system administration, in terms of automating system installs and stuff like that. So that was where I started using Perl for non-biology stuff.
Okay, and what kind of, so mostly system administrator stuff, right?
Mostly system administration stuff, and automation. We were using a system called CF Engine, which is kind of like a precursor to Puppet or Chef, which is basically just a way of throwing files around and automating stuff. And so a lot of the actual automation was written in Perl.
Okay.
And then I was also just doing side programming stuff on my own.
But that's work. When did you started to get involved in community or the open source world or?
That was probably, so the NIH job was located in the Washington, D.C. area. And so when I moved there, I found the D.C. Perlmongers, and started going to those meetings. And that group at that time was kind of not quite dead, but it was definitely on life support. And then at some point, probably in, I think, the mid-2000s, Brock Wilcox, whose handle is AWAID, AWWAIID, he came in and kind of took over the leadership of the group and really got it revived back up. So that was my first real community integration, and the going to the Pittsburgh Perl workshops. When they started having those in, I think also in the early 2000s, kind of got to, after you've been to about the second Perl workshop, you recognize some faces and know some people. And
yeah, it takes time. So yeah, I remember my first YAPC, and it was like, all these strange people.
Yes.
And then it gets better, but you have to go to another one, and so yeah.
Yeah, the second one is always, I think, a much better experience than the first one for most people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is actually a difficult thing. Yeah, I mean, you need to make a good first impression, and then some people stay, and then they'll start enjoying even more.
Yes.
Probably. Okay, so what kind of things do open source related? You're involved in Moose a bit, or?
I'm involved in Moose to a very, very, very tiny extent. I've written, I think there's a role and a couple other packages that use Moose. The biggest thing I think I do Perl-wise is I maintain Git wrapper, which is just a wrapper around Git that's used by a lot of other things that need to interact with Git. There are a lot of Diesel Git plugins that use it. I didn't originally develop it. That was HTTP. Originally developed it, and then Peregrine maintained it for a couple of years. And finally, I sent him enough patches to it that he said, "You know what? You're in charge of this now."
Yeah.
And I said, "What?" So but other than that, just little things here and there.
Do you get feedback for the package or packages that you have?
Yeah, actually, I get some feedback. We just had a long conversation about GitWrapper. We wanted to extend the API in a particular way, and it turned out that there were some people that were using either an undocumented feature or a bug, depending on how you look at it.
Okay.
So we kind of had a long-running discussion for a couple of months about what the best way was to resolve that. And I think finally at this point, I just did a release earlier this week that managed to preserve the old behavior and add the new stuff, mainly by me doing a lot more work, which I wanted to avoid, but I couldn't. So I think everybody ended up happy.
So you actually have to maintain backward compatibility for bugs as well?
Yeah.
Or misfeatures or whatever, right?
The documentation was unclear, and somebody was doing something that they were passing in an object and relying on it getting stringified into a file path, which I was not a big fan of. Kind of made me feel icky that that it worked at all, because I wasn't even stringifying the object myself. I was passing it to something else, and it was getting stringified at a lower level. But it all worked until I started looking at the arguments a little bit more in depth and throwing errors because I was getting a hash reference where I didn't expect one. But it's all sorted out and resolved now, and the documentation is updated to say, if you're not already doing this, don't start stringify stuff before you pass it in, please.
Do you plan to remove that feature or misfeature, or I don't know, and provide a different way and then?
Yeah, I think I would need to add in something more verbose in terms of deprecation warnings, and I'll probably just leave it as it is at this point. There are tests for the old behavior, and it won't break in the future. And once I actually sat down and thought it through, it wasn't that bad. It's just when you sort of have a plan, and then it turns out your plan's not going to work. Your initial reaction is, no, I want to stick with my original plan. So I had to talk myself into doing something more complicated.
Okay, great. There is the zero to Perl, right? That
Right.
you're going to give at YAPC. Why do you teach that?
They actually asked if I was interested in teaching that. I've taught a course in a master's program at Johns Hopkins for the past 4 or 5 years. Well, I've taught it 4 or 5 times over the past 7 or 8 years because they haven't offered it every year. That's designed to get teach biologists Perl, and it leads up to using the BioPerl distribution. So I have some experience in taking people without strong programming backgrounds and getting them up to speed with Perl. And I think Brian DeFoy has done this class a few times in the past at YAPCs. He was unavailable this year. And my company is trying to start doing a little bit more, some more training offerings. And it seemed like a good opportunity. It's generally, I find this type of class it's fun to teach. It's nice to go through that initial period with people where they're kind of frustrated and having difficulty making stuff work, and then get that first, hello world or something a little bit more complicated. That's a good feeling.
Yeah, I mean, I do teach, so I know that part, but I was wondering about teaching there, and it's like almost free, right? It's like 50.
Yeah, it's extremely inexpensive, particularly for what you would normally pay for 2 days worth of training. I don't even remember what the fees is. I think it's either 25 or 50. I don't remember.
Yeah. So you recommend it for people who have no programming background at all, or?
Yeah, I'm going to try to find out. We're going to send out, I think, an email or something leading up to it and try to get an idea of what kind of backgrounds people have coming in so that we can make the best use out of the time. I mean, if everybody that's registered for the class already knows some other programming language, I can accelerate the initial stuff a lot more because you don't have to talk about like what is a variable and stuff like that. But if there are people who don't have any programming experience at all, yeah, we can tailor the material to that too. So it kind of depends on who's registered for it. We'll try to keep everybody engaged the entire time. but yeah,
so you have both lectures and lots of exercises, or?
yeah, we're going to alternate. What I found from the years of teaching experience is you can't talk to people for more than about 20 or 30 minutes before their brains kind of shut down. So we're going to alternate between probably about equivalent amounts of me talking with slides and then hands-on exercises where we'll get people to do some work on, hopefully everybody can bring a laptop or something and circulate and help people over the problems. As you know, programming is one of those things where you have to do it in order to learn it. You just have to do it. So that's what we're going to try to get people to do, and hopefully convince people that are new to this, haven't done any programming before, that they're not going to break anything by experimenting.
Mm-hmm. What would you suggest to someone? Why would someone want to learn Perl now?
Oh, it's a good tricky question. I think there are economic reasons why you would want to learn Perl, right? Maybe you need to know it for your job. Maybe you want to get a job doing Perl, because there seems to be, still, regardless of whether or not the language is dead or dying or zombified or not, there still seems to be a lot of Perl work that needs to be done. But other than that, I think it's a fun, interesting language to learn. Some people just like to learn programming languages. But I guess I don't have a good answer to that question about why you learn Perl. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that you should learn Perl over Python or Ruby or another language in this genre. I think you should learn the language that the people around you who know how to program know, because they're going to be the most effective help you're going to get. So if you know a lot of people who know Perl, you should learn Perl, because it'll be easier for you to get help. But if all your friends know Python, don't learn Perl. Learn Python.
Oh, that would be right. They will kick you out from the friendship.
Perl's a nice language, but other languages are nice too.
Yeah. So do you program in other languages as well?
Yeah, I've been doing the Coursera Scala course.
Mm-hmm.
I've been doing a little playing around with Clojure. Considered looking at Go. That may be my next one. I've done some Python stuff in the past. I've done some PHP. I've done some Ruby. I like Perl better than those, and I know more Perl, and it's sort of more in my head. So even when I'm doing those languages, I'm translating them back into Perl in my head. But yeah, I've done other stuff. I would like to think that I'm very pragmatic in terms of language selection. I'm not very opinionated. As long as you're getting the job done, it doesn't matter. I kind of think of Perl and Python and Ruby as just different dialects of the same underlying language.
Yeah, it's a typical answer of a Perl programmer who thinks about Team Toady and says, well, there are little different solutions. One of them is Python.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, thank you. That was great. Do you have something, a way to get people contact you or contribute to some of your projects that?
So all my stuff's on GitHub. My username is genehack pretty much everywhere. Genehack on CPAN. I'm genehack on GitHub. I'm genehack on Twitter.
You have several websites, genehack, right?
My email is genehack@genehack.com or net will all get to me. So yeah, if I'm happy to take patches for whatever. I've got my GitHub is sort of littered with various hobby projects that got to the point where either I got bored or it worked well enough for me to do what I needed it to do, but I never actually got it to the state where it was good enough for other people. So patches to any of those would be awesome. If you send me, 3 or 4 patches to GitWrapper, you may end up being the new GitWrapper maintainer.
I don't know if you're threatening people or not now. But anyway, really thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you.
And this was John Anderson, genehack. with Gabor Szabo on the Perl Maven TV show. Thank you and goodbye.
See you online.